to order. I want to welcome Ms. Holmes-Norton and Mr. Kucinich, members of the subcommittee, hearing witnesses, and all those in attendance. The purpose of today's hearing is to examine the authority's current financial condition and internal controls, proposed operational and service changes, safety and security initiatives, and to update the subcommittee on pending capital improvements at WMATA and all related funding. The Chair, the Ranking Member, and the subcommittee members will each have 5 minutes to make opening statements, and all members will have 3 days to submit statements for the record. Hearing no objection, it is so ordered. Ladies and gentlemen, again, let me welcome you to the subcommittee's first District of Columbia related oversight hearing of the 111th Congress. As mentioned earlier, the purpose of today's hearing is to explore and examine a host of issues currently confronting the Washington Metropolitan Area Transit Authority in its effort to efficiently operate its Metro Rail, Metro Bus, and Metro Access transit services. It's been a little over 4 years since we, on this committee, have had a Washington Area Transit Authority focused hearing, and while much has improved for what is known as America's transit system, a few systemic challenges continue to remain, and we will try to address those today. Although today's hearing won't bring a final resolution to many of the Transit Authority's core questions of pressing concern, the hearing is intended to continue, in some respects, renew the dialogue between WMATA and regional partners and the federal government. As the primary provider of mass transit throughout the nation's capital and surrounding area, WMATA's operations are intricately intertwined and linked to the continual functionality of the federal government. As many of you are aware, Metro Rail and Metro Bus are responsible for the transportation of nearly 70% of the area's federal workers to and from work on a daily basis. The transit system plays a critical role in our emergency preparedness efforts, and it's often heavily relied upon by the federal government for publicly supported events such as the recent inauguration of our new president or other national mall celebrations. In fact, the mere creation of WMATA by way of the 1967 Interstate Compact was in many ways based upon the rationale that the large presence of federal government activities and the attraction of the nation's capital as a premier tourist destination required the need for the development of a reliable public transit system for the nation's capital and its region. Fast forwarding to today, WMATA has blossomed into a robust and leading transit agency in charge of operating the second largest rail system and the fifth largest bus network in the country, covering about 1,500 square mile areas. WMATA now operates a fleet of some 1,500 buses, serving over 330 routes, and provides Metro Rail services to 86 stations on 5 rail lines and 106 miles of track, much of which has been constructed using federal dollars. While these facts and the region's continued reliability on Metro Rail Bus and its paratransit service points to the access of 30-plus years old transit system, WMATA continues to face serious financial, operational, and now post-September 11 security challenges. To that end, it is my hope that today's hearing will provide the subcommittee with the most current developments in WMATA's operations, finance, safety initiatives, and infrastructure improvement efforts. Whether it's a frank conversation on the remaining facets of WMATA's dedicated funding effort or on management's proposed Metro Bus service cuts and route adjustments, today's oversight proceedings are purely meant to provide us, as a national capital area, stakeholders and the opportunity to discuss and explore common solutions to a common asset, the Washington Metropolitan Area Transit Authority. I'd like to thank those of you who have agreed to testify today, and I understand some of our witnesses obviously didn't take the Metro because they're not here yet. I look forward to a productive but not necessarily lengthy hearing as the subcommittee has been made aware of your various afternoon commitments of our witnesses. And also, I'm sure most are aware, there is a special joint Republican-Democratic caucus regarding the ongoing swine flu epidemic that all members have been asked to attend. So when that begins, obviously the attendance here will decline. But necessarily we will push on and try to address all of the issues that we'd like to address in this hearing. Again, I thank you, and normally I would yield to the ranking member, Mr. Chaffetz from Utah, for his opening remarks. He is also a member of 3 other committees that are currently meeting as well, but he has been kind enough to allow us to waive his statement and to press forward with testimony. At this point, I think it might best serve us, because Mr. Graham is not here and he's on our first panel, if I might defer to my colleagues for their opening statements. It might be a good use of our time. I'd first like to recognize Ms. Eleanor Holmes Norton, who was one of the driving forces to have this hearing so early in our proceedings, and who has been an outspoken advocate for her constituents in their reliance on the Metro Rail service and bus service. So I now recognize Ms. Eleanor Holmes Norton for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I thank you for your early hearing on WMATA, because it signifies the recognition of the subcommittee and the full committee of how dependent we are as a federal government on WMATA and on hearing of its concerns in a time when all facilities of every kind are stretched. I want to congratulate Mr. Cato to his face again, because Mr. Cato, you and your employees performed magnificently during the inauguration. Not only did you provide services at unheard of hours, but when I asked you to even go beyond the call of duty, when you had stretched as far as you could go, you and your employees did so. The entire country, we saw 2 million people come here, could not have had this inauguration at all without you, and we are very proud of the work you have done, sir. The bill that we strove so hard for, the Passenger Rail and Improvement Act, I think we called it, for $1.5 billion over 10 years for WMATA, it seems to me has been vindicated by your performance. Even without a penny of that money flowing, with huge strain on its facilities. At one point, Mr. Cato thought he simply couldn't go much further in keeping hours beyond the expected hours, simply because of the strain on capital facilities, because none of that money has flowed, and even when it flows, it'll have to flow a long time before it makes up for what has been denied. Mr. Chairman, I am also a member of the Homeland Security Committee, and I must say that quite apart from the daily activities of the federal government, we now have an additional reason why we cannot do without WMATA. If nothing else is running, as we learned when the farmers shut down downtown a few years ago, WMATA simply has to be running. And we in Homeland Security have paid special attention to WMATA as well. Now that you have shown, Mr. Cato, what you can do, a lot of us are trying to get that first installment in the $1.5 billion, $150 million due year by year. Somebody tried to hold us up, I think, saying that if you don't do something, we won't do something. Hey, we don't have to do anything. And what members had to do to get this bill in the first place, and what we're going to have to do, even if the president puts it in his budget to keep it in there, I don't even think you want to know about. I just hope that we are able during these hard times to get that first $150 million. I'm very concerned, as I'm sure the entire region is, and while this is seen as a service here in the nation's capital, it stretches far and wide into the region. I am concerned about the layoffs and the bus service issues that have arisen, notwithstanding the Recovery Act funds, and I would be most concerned to see why those Recovery Act funds have not been more helpful in that regard. Again, I can't thank you enough, Mr. Chairman, for the way in which you have moved forward early so that we can make sure that not only the trains keep running on time, but that the federal government keeps running, because the trains are running on time. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Chair will now recognize the gentleman from Northern Virginia, Mr. Connolly, who also, his constituents as well, he's had a long history of dealing with these issues on behalf of the families of Northern Virginia, and is extremely familiar with all the issues confronting WMATA going forward. So I'll recognize the gentleman from Virginia for 5 minutes.
Thank you, and I can't thank you enough, Chairman Lynch, for holding these hearings on the Washington Metropolitan Area Transit Authority. Though many may not be familiar with the acronym WMATA, it is absolutely essential for the operations of the federal government. On average, 120,000 federal employees commute to work in Metro, representing 40% of peak ridership. 56,000 of those employees live in my district, many of whom commute into the Pentagon or Washington, D.C. on the orange, blue, and yellow lines of Metrorail. This transit service is essential, Mr. Chairman, to the quality of life of suburban residents in our region. If not for WMATA's transit system, it would be necessary to construct an additional 1,400 lane miles of highway and 160,000 parking spaces to serve commuters who otherwise now use Metro. This transit service is also essential to protect regional air quality and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Without transit service provided by WMATA, it would be impossible to meet federal clean air standards in this region, which would result in the region losing transportation funding. The decline in ground-level ozone that we've achieved in the region has been enabled by the ability of area residents to avail themselves of rail or bus transit, and by WMATA's investment in compressed natural gas, ultra-low sulfur diesel, and hybrid electric technologies to reduce smog-creating pollutants from buses. With respect to climate change, Metro eliminates 1 million tons of greenhouse gas emissions annually by eliminating vehicle trips, the equivalent of saving 75,000 gallons of gasoline. When the region embarked on construction of the 106-mile Metro system, the federal government, as you indicated, Mr. Chairman, paid 80% of the construction costs. For the extension of the Silver Line, however, to Dulles Airport, the premier airport for the National Capital Region, the federal government will only pay 16% of those project costs. The rest of it is borne by the state and local governments. It is scandalous that the federal government provides a pittance for transit service to the National Capital Region. Extension of transit service is essential not only for the continued operation of the federal government, including provision of transportation options for federally employed commuters, but also for this region's continued economic prosperity. For the past 8 years, we've had to work with an administration that appeared to be ideologically opposed to funding extensions to transit systems. This ideologically driven obstructionism has been harmful to our region and others. With a new administration and a pending transportation authorization bill, I believe that we can jumpstart extensions of transit service here in the National Capital Region and around the country, with the federal government contributing its fair share. I greatly appreciate the work of my predecessor and my colleagues, including Ms. Norton, in passing Title VI of the Passenger Rail Investment and Improvement Act, which provided $150 million in dedicated funding for Metro, being matched by Virginia, Maryland, and the District of Columbia. Metro is the only major transit system in the United States without a dedicated source of funding. In addition to increasing funding for transit, we need to examine ways to eliminate bureaucratic obstacles to new starts. During the process of approving the Rail to Dulles project, we encountered numerous nonsensical requirements that proposed projects had to meet by the federal government. These requirements delayed project approval and construction, adding billions, literally, of cost to the final project cost. We also need to understand how we can move to extend Metro Rail service in our region. Since Metro Rail began operations in 1976, our region has grown far beyond the outer Metro Rail stations. Residents and communities in the suburban Virginia and Maryland should have the option of rail transit. I've introduced legislation, Mr. Chairman, to authorize transit extensions in the orange, blue, yellow, and purple line corridors, and I look forward to hearing Mr. Cato's response to that legislation. I hope this hearing provides the committee with insight on how to expedite these and other extensions. And again, I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding a hearing on this very important topic to the National Capital Region, and I look forward to working with you and my colleagues as we move forward. I thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Connolly. As my Republican colleagues arrive, we will obviously extend them the courtesy of making any opening statements that they wish to make. It is the custom in this committee to ask witnesses to be sworn. I please ask you to rise and raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you will give before this subcommittee today is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Thank you. Let the record show that each of the witnesses has answered in the affirmative. And to begin, your written statements will be accepted into the record without objection. The way the hearing works is that little box in front of you will flash various colors. The green light indicates that you have 5 minutes to summarize your written statement and verbalize the contents to the committee. A yellow light means that you have 1 minute remaining, and then a red light indicates that your allotted time has expired. For the benefit of the members who are here, let me just do a brief introduction of our first panel witnesses. Councilmember Jim Graham became chairman of the Metro Board in January 1999. Mr. Graham currently serves on the Council of the District of Columbia, representing Ward 1. He is also the chair. He also chairs the Council's Committee on Public Works and Transportation. Mr. Graham served as executive director of the Whitman Walker Clinic from 1984 to 1998. Previously, Mr. Graham served as staff counsel for Senator Abe Ribicoff, Democrat of Connecticut, and clerk to Chief Justice Earl Warren, now retired. Mr. John B. Cato is the general manager for Washington Metropolitan Area Transit Authority. Mr. Cato has more than 30 years of experience in public transportation. As general manager of the Washington Metropolitan Area Transit Authority, he oversees the second largest rail transit system and the fifth largest bus network in the United States, with more than 10,000 employees, a $1.3 billion operating budget, and a $3.1 billion 5-year capital improvement program. With that, we welcome each of our witnesses. And Mr. Graham, I welcome you to offer your opening statement.
Thank you very much, Chairman Lynch. Excuse my voice. I'm laboring under the Washington, D.C. allergies. But I'm going to do my, here I have some water here. Maybe that would help me a little bit. I want to do my best here on behalf of the system. As you point out, I'm the chairman of the Metro WMATA board. I have previously held this position in 2003, which was a very different time than today. But it is all the same a time of great excitement for the Metropolitan Washington Area Transit Authority. I want to say a special hello to Congressman Connolly. This is the first time I've seen you since your ascendancy to this great body. I congratulate you, and to my congressional representative, Eleanor Holmes Norton, it's always a great pleasure to see you. We saw each other yesterday at a very, very happy event, and I hope this one today is every bit as happy and satisfying. Let me just note that the Metro means more than anything else mobility. Metro Rail and Metro Bus serve a population of over 3.5 million within within 15,000 square mile area. An average weekday passenger trips on the two systems total nearly 1.3 million. Metro Access, which is our service to people living with disabilities, provides 4,900 passenger trips on an average weekday. No neighborhood or community within the District of Columbia is more than 2 blocks from Metro bus services. Metro also stimulates regional economic development. And, Mr. Chairman, I don't need to read about that because I know in Ward 1, in Columbia Heights, in U Street, on Georgia Avenue, the presence of a subway station has been the absolute catalyst to the economic revival of those neighborhoods. We have much to thank for Metro in that regard. Metro is not only essential to the efficient functioning of this region, but it is also essential to the daily operations of the federal government, which gives the federal government a most decided stake in terms of the success of this system. The federal government relies on Metro for daily transportation of visitors to the Capitol and national events. You have already, I believe Congresswoman Norton mentioned the great role that Metro played in the recent inauguration, and we're extremely proud of our general manager who has served with distinction here and elsewhere. Metro is a critical component for ensuring continuity of federal government operations during an emergency. 9/11 is another example of how Metro really made the key difference in terms of keeping that system, keeping our system open. Let me say a word about dedicated funding. At this point in time, as a member of the Council of the District of Columbia and chairman of the Committee on Public Works and Transportation, we're going to make certain that this opportunity for dedicated funding is not lost, nor will it be hindered. And I will introduce legislation in the Council on an emergency basis on May 5th to have identical legislation to that which was passed in Virginia and Maryland, so that we will be ready, Mr. Chairman, to present to this Congress compact amendments which are identical and will pave the way, hopefully, in this year for a federal appropriation. We are extremely pleased with the great step that was taken by the Congress last year in passing an authorization which could lead to $3 billion into the system over a 10-year period. And we want to make certain that that happens. When I became chairman of the Metro Board this past February, I expressed my determination that this funding would go forward insofar as anything we could do to make it happen. We are anxiously awaiting news as to whether or not the President has included the first payment, which we hope will amount to $150 million, in the President's budget. If the President has not included it in the budget, we want to rely on our many good friends in Congress to make sure that the $150 million is added. And I do want to acknowledge most particularly the efforts of the Majority Leader, Congressman Steny Hoyer, who has played such a key role in this regard. So this $300 million new funds on an annual basis, $150 million from the Congress of the United States, $150 million from each, $50 million each from the three jurisdictions, is going to make a critical difference in the stability of Metro, because at present what we need to do is to assemble a patchwork quilt every year with our budget, and this will instead give us the ability for a coherent, stable budget proposal. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Graham. Mr. Cato, you're recognized for 5 minutes for your opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As stated, I'm John Cato, the General Manager of the Washington Metropolitan Area Transit Authority, known as WMATA or Metro. Joining me is Michael Taborn, who's the Chief of the Metro Transit Police Department, who's available to answer questions on our security initiatives. First, I would like to begin by thanking you, as well as the members of this full committee, for your efforts on the dedicated funding legislation. The funding authorized by that bill is a key to Metro's ability to continue to meet the mobility needs of the federal government in this region. I have submitted more detailed testimony for the record, so let me address a few key points that I would be happy to take questions on. As Chairman Graham said, the federal government relies on Metro every day. It bears repeating that 40% of Metro's peak ridership is made up of federal employees. Many others ride our system so they can petition the Congress, visit the National Mall and our national museums and galleries, and also to witness historic events like the inauguration. You can hear it in our station names: Federal Triangle, Capitol South, Smithsonian, Pentagon, and the list goes on. The federal government's dependence on Metro is something that distinguishes us from other transit agencies. It is not surprising that Metro is often referred to as America's subway. I would like to now turn to some of our current challenges. While we have been in fairly good financial shape for this budget year, 2009, this is a very difficult time for Metro, as it is for transit agencies across the country, with many facing layoffs and severe service cuts. Recognizing the pressure that local governments and individuals are facing in this economic downturn, we began building our FY 2010 budget without indicating any increases from local government or their contributions or raising fares. This required very difficult actions. In recent months, I have made some very tough decisions, including the elimination of 313 positions. And we have reduced our budget gap from $154 million. We've reduced that by 80% down to $29 million, and with the jurisdictions looking at various options have reduced that even further. After considering many options for closing the remaining gap, our board ultimately decided to increase, as I mentioned, local contributions, and we have submitted bus services adjustment for public considerations. We have just completed a series of 6 hearings on these service adjustments, and tomorrow the Board of Directors will make decisions on what actions they will take in order to close the budget gap. In my written testimony, I also go into detail about another financial challenge that affects Metro and a number of other transit agencies who entered into sell-leaseback transactions back when the federal government was promoting them as innovative financing techniques. As a result of changes to federal law and of the worldwide economic crisis, Metro and other agencies are at risk of a technical default on these agreements. Despite having made payments, we potentially face millions of dollars in termination fees. However, all is not grim, and we need to look towards the future. Let me turn now from Metro's current financial challenges to talk a little bit about what I see coming in Metro's future. This system is essential to mobility in the nation's capital and the National Capital Region, as shown on Inauguration Day. Millions came to Washington to see the new president, and Metro's job was to provide them with transportation. We did so safely and efficiently. When you look towards the future is what we saw on that day. Over 1.5 million riders on our system on a daily basis. As we move towards the future, there is a need for increased funding for an expansion of the system on the orange, blue, yellow lines, and in fact, a new portal coming in from Northern Virginia. As we looked at our capital needs, we have identified $11.3 billion between 2011 and 2020, and this number does not include any monies for the expansion that I mentioned. We're now working to prioritize this, and we will have that list completed over the next week. Again, you will find more details of my testimony in front of you in the written testimony, and I thank you for this opportunity to testify in front of this subcommittee.
Thank you, Mr. Cato. In the interest of time and efficiency, we're going to dispense with any further opening statements here. But I would like to ask, since both of you have been at this for such a long time, Mr. Graham, the reconciling language on the part of the District of Columbia to match the legislation previously passed by Virginia and Maryland, where are we in that process? I know there's been some good signals sent, but legislatively, where are we?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The legislature in Virginia and the legislature in Maryland have now passed, and just recently passed, identical legislation to the compact amendments. On May 5th, I will introduce in the Council as emergency legislation the identical legislation, okay, which means that certainly in the month of May we are going to be ready to present to Congress the compact amendments that are required by the Authorization Act.
Great. Well, that's perfect. The sooner the better, obviously. I wouldn't want to give any reason for the President's budget team to see an obstacle there and to send the wrong signals that money is not prepared to be used or that there are any obstructions there. So if we could get that wrapped up, that would be enormously helpful. I just don't want to leave any obstacle in the way. Mr. Cato, I know that I'm actually part of the Rail Security Caucus here in Congress and spend a lot of time. I think the numbers are that in this country we have about 5 times as many people who travel by rail as do by airplane. We've spent a lot of money on security in airports. I don't think we've spent nearly what we need to in terms of rail security. You're part of a system that, this Northeast Corridor, that handles a huge portion of our rail passengers every day. And because of all the things you've mentioned today about this being our nation's capital, moving so many federal employees, being the heart of our federal government, being the nation's capital, so we have extremely large celebrations, historic moments here in the Capitol. The inauguration, perfect example. You know, I think, you know, someone who had their family down for those festivities, the Metro really delivered very, very well. I wish all the parts of our system worked as well as Metro did. But what's being done to coordinate the larger, I would say, terrorist-centric dimension of rail security with the D.C. Metro? I mean, how is that working out? Do we have a good coordination? I know you got the chief behind you. He probably can answer. I don't want to put him on the spot, but how is that going?
Our relationship with TSA, the Department of Homeland Security, and the Federal Transit Administration, I would rate it as excellent. I have had meetings with all 3 agencies to talk about coordination of security, not only here in Washington, but across the United States. They have been helpful. Could we use more monies in security? Absolutely. But given the resources that we have maximized those resources. We've had great support from the TSA as well as the Federal Transit Administration. And so from a coordination standpoint, given the resources that we have, it's a very good relationship and it's excellent coordination.
Okay, let me ask. I just came back from Mumbai. We've done a lot of coordination with different jurisdictions that have been affected. We had a rail summit with the cooperation of the folks in London. It seems to me that the greatest value has come from training rail workers to actually handle that situation. And some folks think they have a plan, but if the employees don't know the plan, we don't have a plan. The people that are on those, the rail crews that are on those trains, that in the event, God forbid, we have a disaster on the Northeast Corridor or on the Metro, those folks have to know what they need to do. And that's been deficient in a lot of other jurisdictions. And how is that piece going with your employees?
It's going very well. Our chief of police, he worked for us and then he worked for the Federal Transit Administration. We had a national responsibility for developing training programs on safety as well as security issues. He brought that experience back to us, and as a result, not only do we have written publications that have been given to each employee, but we also have training for all employees and constant reminders of the importance of being the eyes and the ears of security. And also, we're taking it a step further. We do periodic announcements to our customers, as well as provide information to this region of asking them to support us in providing security for this system.
Great. I see my time has expired. At this point, I'd like to yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from California, Mr. Bilbray.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I want to apologize for my tardiness. Those of us in California don't function with rain very well, so you just understand that we were all looking up saying, what is that wet stuff? Let me first, Mr. Graham, let me congratulate you on your chairmanship. And I come from where you're coming from. I served as chairman of the San Diego Trolley Board. In fact, I was on the board that built the light rail system when everybody said no one is ever going to have rail transit in Southern California. But there is a whole lot of challenges we get into it. And this, you know, Mr. Cato's works came out of BART, right?
The Los Angeles system.
Okay, yeah. In fact, I'll tell you, we had some run-ins with our insurance companies over the problems you ran there, trying to build two systems simultaneously.
Yes.
I guess we led a bad example for you. You looked at our success and figured it was easy, but you learned it real quick how tough it was. But, Mr. Graham, my biggest concern coming from local government, I was chairman of a county of 3 million. I served as chairman of the Transit Board. And the disconnect between local land use and local policymakers and mass transit. I think that one thing we can say, there are probably only two things that we can point to for the American people that really work well in this community. That is the meter maids and the transit system. I apologize to the delegate, but as a local government guy, it's the frustration of always, we don't do enough in local government. One of the studies, Mr. Graham, that we really looked at when I was serving on the Air Resources Board in California was the huge benefit in air pollution and reduction in fuel consumption if the locals will coordinate development patterns to reflect the market demands for transit. I think too often, especially it's one of my frustrations in Southern California, they say, why don't we have more? And I said, well, there's no market there. We haven't developed, we haven't developed in a pattern of market. Though D.C. probably, as well as any community, has tried to respond to opportunities created by the Metro, how aggressive are we in our local land use patterns in this region of actually not only allowing but mandating intensification development around these transit centers, not just after they're constructed, but a good example is the proposal out to the airport. How much pressure is being put on the local people to rethink, re-engineer, and rezone, even in opposition to local community concerns, based on the fact that this transit system needs to have that kind of support. And I say that with the former chairman of Fairfax out there. We need to put that pressure on. And I say that from an environmental point of view, that I just had a community abandon its density around a transit center. And I understand I came from a small city. But is there anybody there doing the pushback to look at the big picture and try to counter that not in my backyard so that we address these things properly, both from the environmental and to make Metro more economically viable?
Would the gentleman yield?
Yes.
Just because you did invoke my jurisdiction, I'm pleased to assure my colleague, in the Dulles corridor, which is 23.1 miles, we completely redid the rezoning at high-end density so that it will be a transit-oriented development corridor along all of the planned stations. A very dramatic change in land use pattern. It was not without some controversy, but we did it.
Yeah, in fact, I'll just say, Mr. Graham, flat out, somebody coming with from the air side, I believe that the Clean Air Act should be amended to require it so that it helps local people to do the right thing rather than, because the politics pushes the other way, as you know, and as the former chairman knows. But yeah, as a local government guy, I'd like your comments about that whole issue. And I know it's not something we talk about because this is long-term, but that does matter. Go ahead.
Well, Congressman, you've already referenced the fact that you have one of the leading experts on this issue, on a member of your very panel here, and that is Congressman Connolly, who has spent a lot of time making these things happen, in Northern Virginia. Let me just speak for the District of Columbia. I mean, we have truly embraced the whole concept of restore the core, through the joint development program at Metro WMATA. And you can see virtually all of our stations in the District of Columbia have benefited from, the joint development efforts. And, this is example after example. In fact, I think in some ways, with all due respect to my colleagues on the Metro Board, I mean, D.C. has led the way. Columbia Heights, U Street, Georgia Avenue, downtown Gallery Place, if you look at our living downtown, so much of this is traceable right back, to Metro's abilities to develop the land near its stations. And so it's been, I think it's really a huge success story. And I occasionally chide our distinguished general manager that I think we should do a far more flamboyant job of saying how well we're doing in this regard, because it's made an absolutely critical difference in the District of Columbia.
Okay, and just to be balanced on this, a lot of this is not the community opposition. A lot of times intensification development is the property owner, the land developer, will not be looking 20, 30 years ahead, is looking for what's marketable today and not worrying about the big picture. And I think this issue of siting of transit centers in a community is a responsibility that the community has to reflect, that part of having the privilege of having these lines come in is that they need to accommodate them to where they're economically viable. And you got developers sometimes who do not want to develop out to the density. And I've told them flat out, I'd rather have an empty lot that someday will be dense rather than average out and allow you to respond to an existing market today rather than looking to the future. I thank you very much. I yield back, Mr.
Thank you. The Chair now recognizes the gentlelady from the District of Columbia, Ms. Holmes Norton, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I congratulate the district was the first to put up its share initially when we were going for these funds, and it helped in our advocacy. I don't know, Mr. Bilbray, I think that Mr. Cato's, I like to ascribe Mr. Cato's success to the fact that he's a native Washingtonian, but I guess I'll let that go. Let me ask you both this. WMATA has recently listed its use of recovery funds. Will those be obligated? You know, we're tracking these funds, and there's another committee I'm on, Transportation Infrastructure, you know, has a use it or lose it rule. What assurance can you give us that those funds will be obligated within those 90 and I guess 120-day timeframes?
Congresswoman, absolute assurance. In fact, the communications I've given to the Federal Transit Administration has been WMATA will spend their dollars on capital programs that will again help the operation of the system before the timelines indicated in the legislation.
Do you have any idea how many jobs will be created?
Yes, over 4,800 jobs will be created.
I was amazed to note that you apparently have had some trouble getting bus drivers, or at least that was what was said when there was a bus driver who was caught in some kind of malfeasance, and he turned out to have been recently released from prison. We like the fact in this committee that ex-offenders can get jobs of that kind. He seemed to have been rather recently released, and a spokesman said spoke of the difficulty in getting bus drivers. Here are good union, high-paying jobs. Could you explain what the difficulty has been?
Well, we have not had difficulties in the recent years, recent 2 years. There have been peaks and valleys if you go back and look over the past 10 years of the availability of individuals for that workforce. But recently, when we had a job fair, we had hundreds and hundreds of applications, in fact, over 1,000. The issue becomes when we go through the screening process, that number drops significantly. Out of 1,000 applicants, 100 might make it through the initial
apparently
screening.
you could have a felony. You could have a felony, and I'm not arguing against that. It seems to me it has to be job related in order for somebody to be disqualified because he's been in prison. So what is it because people have not? I mean, you train drivers, don't you?
Yes, we do. We
So
train.
The numbers drop, and I say if this man who was recently released from prison could become a driver, I'm wondering what it is. Certainly having a record isn't the reason it drops. What is the reason that the numbers drop so precipitously?
Primarily, it's a skill set. It's the hours that we work once people get into the interview process. Often it is a felony record. We require that employees not have had a felony or major one in the last 2 to 4 years. This was an anomaly in our process. It was in something that occurred. The felony occurred 10 years before. Unfortunately, we didn't take into effect that he was in prison during that 10 years.
Yeah.
We've corrected our processes since then. I can assure you that that will not occur again. But in fairness of the employees that we have hired who happen to have had some felony, and we have several of those, there have been outstanding operators, outstanding employees.
And we would certainly encourage that. That was unfortunate. Great priority of mine and of the Congress, of the administration, is alternative fuels. I don't know if they're hybrid buses. I know they're natural gas buses. When you buy new equipment, such as buses, are you focusing on greening WMATA?
Yes, and yes, we are. Every vehicle that we purchase now, every bus will be either a hybrid or compressed natural gas, and that decision was made by our board of directors
That is
several years
just
ago.
exceptional news. We, some of us fought up here for WMATA to buy natural gas buses during the last go-round. It was quite a fight. I know that some difference in cost, but we now have come to understand those differences are very important. The Amalgamated Transit Union has written a letter that we have received that we allow the use of federal transit funds for operating assistance purposes. I think they were concerned with the layoffs that have been so decried in this region. Would this help solve your dilemma? Can any of those funds be used to help thwart the layoffs? Is there any flexibility on this issue that you have or would suggest?
There is some flexibility under the preventative maintenance, and for the upcoming budget, we did transfer additional preventative maintenance dollars over, so it relieves your operating side. But when you take from one side to the other, you're creating a larger problem on your capital side, and that's where we have the largest need. But any funding that we receive, of course, helps us provide the services that we need in this region. But we can't take all of our capital dollars and turn them into operating expenses.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Chair, now recognize the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Conley, for 5 minutes.
I thank the chair. Let me welcome both Chairman Graham and Manager John Cato to the subcommittee hearing. And Mr. Graham, I want to thank you for your willingness to introduce emergency legislation. Quite candidly, I wish you didn't have to, because I actually think the D.C. approach is the correct approach. Because the big sticking point is whether we have permanent federal membership on the Metro Board or not. My view is we should have federal voting representation so long as federal funds are flowing. And while I understand the necessity, and I completely agree with the chairman, we don't want any impediment or any excuses for that $150 million matching federal funds. I do believe that we are going to come to regret someday in the future having two federal members who are going to be voting on how localities should be spending their money. And I just think, you know, and then you're going to have to amend the compact at some future date, wondering how did this happen. But unfortunately, we didn't win that battle. But I think you were right in the first place. I recently introduced a bill to authorize extensions of Metro Rail's orange, blue, yellow, and purple lines in Northern Virginia. Mr. Cato, I just wonder if you might comment on the, how that might help or hurt Metro and what your attitude is about future extensions.
Well, it's going to be critical as we move forward to the future to have extensions. And with those extensions, not only the extension of the line, but looking at another portal coming into our main service area. So your legislation is timely. We're reaching capacity very quickly on our rail system. And this legislation begins the process of taking that into consideration for future expansion.
The federal government process for funding transit is quite different than the federal government funding of roads and bridges. Could you comment on that a little bit, and any ideas based on your experience, especially with most recently rail to Dulles, but in any expansions of the Metro system, any suggestions about how we might streamline the federal process?
Absolutely. The suggestion is to make the transit funding process very similar to the highway process. It is more complex. It requires a cost-benefit analysis. The process to go through takes longer, as you are very aware of with the Dallas extension. And I've had discussions with the Federal Transit Administration. They are aware of it. It will take some action on the part of, I believe, Congress to change the legislation. And you'll have that opportunity with the reauthorization bill that's coming up this year.
I look forward to working with Chairman Oberstar and trying to do that, and you as well. Mr. Graham made reference to the economic benefits, and I think rightfully so said D.C., and I would say the inner suburbs, Arlington and inner suburbs of Maryland, clearly show the transformative value of the transit investment. I was here. I lived in Washington, D.C. in 1972 through 1977, so I saw pre-Metro Washington and post-Metro Washington, and it has been nothing short of transformative. And I think Mr. Bilbray is right in raising that issue of the land-use relationship, but also what is the return on investment. Have we got some methodology for calculating what the return on the investment of Metro has been to the National Capital Region?
The latest numbers, in fact, I had them updated today, showed an investment of $25 billion. But when we updated that number, we found that really the investment has been $40 billion in the District of Columbia only.
You mean the economic investment?
The economic benefits of the Metro system.
Wow.
And it's much larger when you take it from a regional perspective.
And what was the original federal investment?
I don't recall, $6 billion. Yes.
So a pretty good return on investment. Final question, because I'm going to run out of time. We don't have we don't yet, but hopefully, as Mr. Lynch said, we will soon have a dedicated source of funding through this legislation. How do other transit systems do it in terms of dedicated funding sources?
Generally, most transit agencies have the local sales tax, or it's specified in their legislative state legislation that a portion of the state revenues will go to public transit. We're unique. The only large transit property in the United States does not have a sales tax funding source.
Could I just add, because we're right in the middle of doing our D.C. budget, and I just want to add that the District of Columbia will be sending more than $300 million in our subsidy and other financial contributions in FY10 to give some idea of the magnitude of the local support that the District of Columbia is providing to this system.
And I know my time is up, Mr. Chairman, but I can't help but observing on the tragedy of 9/11, I remember very well there was thank goodness, an abortive attempt to close Metro. Had we in fact closed Metro that day, we would have, I think, we'd still be, in gridlock in this region. But thanks to Metro, a situation that could have been much, much worse was not, and it just underscored just the importance of the Metro system in getting workers, especially federal workers, to and from their homes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I know that we have two members that are trying to get here for this panel, and why don't I do this? I know we don't exhaust all of the issues in our questioning. How about, Mr. Graham and Mr. Cato, if you have any issues that we haven't touched upon that you think are keenly important to the system and to our work, I'd like to give you each, say, 5 minutes to address the issues that are on your mind most prominently, and if any of that embrace the issues that you might have on, I read the audit report from 2008. I noticed a pretty good spike in utilization of workers' compensation, pretty good spike or a gap in funding on the pension side. If you might have information on those couple of issues, would like to hear that, and hopefully by the time you're finished addressing those, the members might be here. I don't want to keep you longer than you've been very generous with your time, but please.
Well, I will gladly take this opportunity, Mr. Chairman. As I was making my presentation, I went through a few pages because of time running out. But again, as mentioned, the Metro system is beginning to fill its age. And an analogy I like to make, it's like a house is over 32 years old, and we need to go beyond a spring cleaning or a paint job. We need some major work done. We have a wet basement, rusty pipes, and old wiring and other issues. And so from the standpoint, as we look towards the new transportation bill, the reauthorization, as we in the industry like to talk about, this authorization is to ensure that sufficient funds are there to keep major transit agencies in a state of good repair. The federal government has made a tremendous investment in this system, and that investment needs to be kept in a state that we can continue to move people as we do today, and also to expand that. So that's a point as you look forward. From the standpoint of workers' compensation, when I arrived here just over 2 years and 4 months ago, we had major issues from a safety standpoint for our employees and our customers. And we've come a long way. We've had recently, and it's communicated to the board, decreases in the number of work-related injuries, 10, 20, 30% of injuries over the past 2.5 years. That still isn't good enough, and we're working to reduce that even more so. From the standpoint of our issues with our customers, our operators have been performing at a much higher rate of safety. We've moved from a situation of the nightmare of 5 fatalities. My first year in 2007, pedestrian fatalities to 0 last year. And knocking on wood, 0 hopefully for the next decades and decades ahead. And I attribute that to our safety program and the attention of our senior operators. We're working very hard again on the workers' comp. We've hired a new risk manager who began 2 weeks ago. We've got the claims down. Now we're really managing those claims far better than what we had before. And so we're in a transition as an organization that's focusing on safety. And you will see major improvements both financially as well as in the number of injuries. From a pension standpoint, like every organization around the country and every federal and private agency, we've been hit tremendously by the downturn of the stock market. And as a result, we will be looking at, we still will make our contributions. We're committed, they're sufficiently funded, but in order to make up that difference, it's going to take a longer period of time.
Very good. I understand. We have one of our members just trying to get in. In the meantime, I'd like to offer Ms. Holmes Norton a chance to expound on an earlier question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I didn't get to ask a couple of questions. First, let me ask, when was the last fare increase for WMATA?
1 year ago, January, there was a fare increase that was in place.
My impression is that what you're trying to do today, you of course have to do. You have the notion of fares going up. But my impression is that WMATA has withheld fare increases over long periods of time and then had to raise fares. And I wonder if you've given thoughts to, or if other transit systems simply put off the day of reckoning and then have to make a larger fare increase than would otherwise be necessary. Just because they hate it and the public hates it ever. So they're going to hate it, but they may hate it more if you have to make up for lost time.
Well, if I may respond to that,
yes, sir, Mr.
Congresswoman. What we were ending up with when we started talking about a fare increase was a very tiny amount of money in the scheme of things. We were talking about a remaining budget gap of $29 million. And as we were able to demonstrate, the jurisdictions rapidly came up with more than half of that in additional subsidy payments, including the District of Columbia, including Fairfax County, and elsewhere.
Well, this time, Mr. Graham, I understand. I was, and you've been on the WMATA board before. I was actually, because I don't see how you could have raised fares with a straight face, but I'm wondering whether or not transit authorities have any policy on whether or not it's best to wait for a long period of time. You've just raised one, so it would have been terrible to raise another. Let the needs build up because the public hates it so bad, or is that's just you just have to do that almost politically and decide when you can do it and when you can't.
Well, I can express my own personal philosophy in this regard.
Thank you.
I have generally not favored fare increases, except when it was absolutely necessary. And we did it a year ago, January, as Mr. Cato pointed out. At that time, we held the bus riders harmless in terms of any increase, on the theory that they were the least able to pay. But we did manage to have to raise the revenues that we needed all the same. And I think having just raised the fares, I don't think we want to go back to that well when we don't need to. And the fact of the matter is this $29 million remaining budget gap was rapidly filled within a few days by the jurisdictions. And
yeah,
I
when
think
people saw that what they faced was
that tells the tale.
Yeah, with raising fares, they quickly came over. Could I just ask Mr. Cato perhaps to get this back to me? WMATA may have to take the lead on this. I have been getting money in the transportation bill because WMATA needs the First Street Tunnel at where Amtrak or Union Station is located because of the need to improve access to BRE, MARC, to the NOMA section of D.C., and in order to continue to get those funds, somebody's going to have to take the lead. It seems to me that between Amtrak and WMATA, and WMATA has the most to gain, we all need to meet. I've had pretty good luck, but there is a reauthorization coming up. So that's when you have the best luck. I wonder if you have any views on that or any plans given the fact that there's really regional trains, rapid rail and the like coming in to Union Station and redoing where they can go so to accommodate more such
Absolutely.
transit.
In fact, we are participating, but I've directed my staff to work with the entire region in taking a leadership role in the coordination of rail services to ensure that we're using similar technology and also to ensure the connectability of the system. So we will be getting back to the committee with the latest update on this very shortly, but we are actively involved, and I can assure you we will stay involved and take whatever role that's necessary.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. The Chair now seeks unanimous consent to allow Mr. Van Hollen, the gentleman from Maryland, to proffer questions to the witnesses. Hearing no objections, the gentleman from Maryland is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank you for holding this hearing, and I want to thank you for your support for what is often described as the nation's metro system, because it does carry so many federal employees to work every day that do the work of our country here in Washington. And I want to thank both the gentlemen for their testimony. Councilmember Graham, I commend you for the legislation that you've introduced. I think when you complete action on that, it will mean Maryland, Virginia, and the District of Columbia have all passed the required legislation to conform with the requirements for the additional federal funds for Metro. So we look forward to continue to work with you on that effort. Mr. Cato, congratulations on a good, strong start. I know it's been a little while now, but things seem to be going well, although I do have a couple concerns that I wanted to raise. And this is in the context, first let me ask you about the stimulus dollars, the economic recovery plan dollars. If you could just provide some real detail on exactly what additional funds the Metro system expects to receive as a result of the economic recovery plan and what exactly that means with respect to WMATA operations.
We will receive approximately $202 million as part of the economic stimulus package, some for buses, paratransit vehicles, fixing platforms, rail work, heavy equipment for the rail system. To date, we have 40 of those contracts on the street, so we're ready to move forward to spend the monies, and we have sent our necessary paperwork to the Federal Transit Administration, and that process is moving very smoothly.
Now, do you expect to receive that $202 million in this fiscal year over a period of what period of time?
We expect to commit 80% of the dollars by September and the remaining 20% by the end of the calendar year.
Okay. And so by the end of the calendar year, you will expect all the contracts to have been let. Is that
yes.
correct? Okay. I do have a concern. I know you, hopefully you've received a letter that Steny Hoyer and I and Donna Edwards sent to you and your team about the cuts that have been made in Metrobus in the suburban Maryland area in both Prince George's and Montgomery County. I mean, we are very concerned about the impact. More people obviously rely on public transit during a period of economic downturn. Our hope had been that these stimulus dollars, these additional stimulus dollars, would allow you to continue to operate these kind of lines. And so a lot of people are wondering, you know, where'd that money go? How come we can't be using some of that money to make sure that people can continue to get to work?
Well, those monies, some of those monies can be used for preventative maintenance, which would offset some of the costs. We just had a series of hearings, 5 of those. Tomorrow, the Board of Directors will consider what it needs to do to close the gap, which is just slightly over $13 million. Capital dollars or stimulus dollars can be used to close the gap, or other reserve monies that we have, or we can make the service cuts. Those discussions will occur tomorrow. I might like to mention that Chairman Graham did propose that at one time that we use stimulus dollars. That, again, decision will be discussed tomorrow.
Well, I encourage you, and Chairman, thank you for proposing that we use stimulus dollars to keep some of these lines and services operational, because, again, as we said, I mean, more and more people are turning to Metro, which in these economic times, and we of course want to encourage people, whether times are tough or times are good, to use our public transit system. So I hope we wouldn't be cutting those services. If I could just ask one other question, Mr. Chairman, with respect to where Metro stands now on the issue that arose last year with respect to the leaseback payments that were then essentially guaranteed through AIG and the credit default swaps, and there was the threat and litigation. And I think we all worked together to try and mitigate the impact. If you could just give us an update on where things stand.
Okay, thank you very much. We had 16 leaseback transitions, 3 which we resolved and closed, 1 through the court process we came to a settlement. We have 12 remaining. Again, they are no longer any AAA rated insurers, which technically put us in default, and which would expose millions of taxpayers' dollars. They're still at risk in spite of the fact we're making all the payments. And so we're hoping that there will be some legislative solution or an administrative solution from the Treasury Department. Thus far, no other banks have notified us that they are going to declare us in default, but technically they could do that at any day.
All right. Well, we look forward to continuing to monitor that situation. And again, thanks for, hope tomorrow we will not make those service cuts. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
Just real briefly, Mr. Cato just mentioned that there are no AAA insurers left, and that is a problem for all municipalities issuing bonds in the United States. I have some legislation that is before the House Finance Committee. We are going to have hearings in May on that legislation that would address that situation.
Thank you, sir.
Well, we want to thank the witnesses for being so free and candid and generous with your time. We are sure that there'll be other hearings where we'll have to call you again for your opinions and recommendations. But thank you for attending this hearing, and we bid you good day.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I would like to